Session 8 is about I/O. I don't know if you've seen that abbreviation before, but I/O stands for input output. Sometimes I've seen a number of IT conferences called I/O, and they're using that colloquially to mean, input output of information between people at the conference. But I/O refers specifically to input output, usually between either a machine and a network or between a program and the operating system. One of the things we want to emphasize in this session is that your Python program is running within the environment of the operating system. The operating system being Windows, the Mac, Unix. These operating systems are responsible for running the programs and handling their input and their output. So, of course, we've been working with output quite a lot in our program so far, because every time that you print something, it's going to the screen. Now, that doesn't mean that Python puts it on the screen. Literally, what it means is that Python is delivering output to the operating system, and the operating system is putting it on the screen. So what we're going to look at in this session has to do with the ways in which Python can read input and deliver output. Now, we've looked at input from a couple of sources so far. In the very beginning of the class, we looked at the input function. The input function allowed us to pause execution and allow the OS, I can't seem to type here, allow the OS to read input from the keyboard. You remember this from earlier in the class. The other thing that we did was read input from sysargv. Sysargv is what we're going to look at first. This is a review, but goes along with this session, so we should mention it again. When we're talking about arguments of the command line, of course, we're talking about things that you can type at the command line, at the place where you execute your Python program, and see and get that input into your program. The command line is where I've been having us run our Python programs, because I want you to see right away exactly how we're executing the Python program and what that means, and also so that you can get input into your program quite easily through the command line. You can also run your programs through the IDE, through PyCharm, and there are other IDEs that will run your Python program. But I chose for us to run from the command line from the very beginning, just so that there's no confusion about what we're actually doing. When we run a Python program, we say Python and then the name of the script. What we're doing is saying to the operating system, please run Python. Run the Python program itself. That is, the language has an interpreter, and that interpreter is what we're running when we run Python. And then feed it the name of our script. That's what we're doing here when we say Python and then the name of a py file. We're giving that py file to Python, but we're asking the operating system to do it. Now, as we talked about earlier in the class, and something I want to re-emphasize because there's sometimes confusion about it, when you want to pass arguments to your own program, you can pass them at the command line. I could say 1, 2, 3 here. Actually, it's really 2 levels deep, because I'm passing 3 arguments to my Python program, and we're actually feeding all of that to the Python interpreter. But let's just look at it as passing arguments to our Python program. When I do that, those arguments are handled by the operating system. They are passed to our script, and our script makes it available to us through the sysargv list. Now, you look closely at our 2 print statements and correlate that with what you're seeing in the output. sys.argv is a list. Now, it's a strange looking list because we've only seen lists that are named, my list, or, our fields, or whatever we wanted to name our list. This sys.argv, number one, we didn't name it. sys.argv comes from the operating system. I'm sorry, excuse me. Sys.argv is defined by Python. And sys.argv is a list that automatically has values when we run the program. If you look closely again, and you can see that because when I print the type of sys.argv, I see it's a list. But if you look at that list, you look at the contents of this list, you see that the first item it's all strings. The first item is a string with the name of the script. That's going to be always there. It doesn't really matter what you do. If I run my script without any arguments, I'm still going to see a list, and I'm still going to see one item in it. That one item is going to be the file name. Now keep this in mind, because the sysargv list will always have one item. Always has one item, and it may contain others. Always at least one item. That's important, because we're going to want to be able to use the length of sysargv in order to check to see if any arguments were passed. Look what happened when I ran the Python script and I passed it 3 arguments, 3 what look like integers, but they come in as strings no matter what. 3 numeric strings here. They come to me as 3 numeric strings in the list. This I can use to read my command line arguments. So we did this before, but I can just reiterate that if you're interested in, let's say, taking 2 arguments in your program, maybe you want, let's say, the year that you're looking at and maybe higher or lower. Who knows what? It doesn't really even matter. But I can say something like year equals sys.argv1, and let's say sort direction equals sys.argv2. And then I can be printing those things. And when I run the script, if I say something like 1927 and ascending, I will see that those 2 values got copied to my variable names because they were in sys.argv1 and sys.argv2. Now, just consider that this is a very, very simple mechanism. The only magic part that you have to keep in mind is that sys.argv will always be a list. It will always be there. It will always have at least one item, and it will have any additional items that you pass at the command line. They will come in as strings. So just keep that clear. Sys.argv will always be there, and it will always be a list. And it may contain any arguments that we passed at the command line. Now, question would be, or one question that I might have for you is, what would happen if we attempted to read these arguments, but they weren't actually passed at the command line? So you have to ask yourself, if I ran the script as it is right now, and you may want to stop the video and see if you can answer this question, what am I going to see in sys.argv? What's going to be in there? And thus, what will happen when I attempt to read the second and third arguments from that list? Okay, let's find out. Well, I'll tell you first. You know that sys.argv is a list that will always be there, and you know it always has one item in it. And as we saw before, if we run the program and don't pass any arguments, we're going to see that one item in the list, but we're not going to see any other items in the list. So the answer to the question, what will happen when I try to read the second and third arguments, is that I'm going to get an index error. The index error says, I tried to read the second item from the list, but it's not there. An index error simply says, I was trying to reach this index. You can see the problem occurred on line 5, and the item that was missing was index 1. That is the second item of the list. When you try to do that, Python has a problem with it. There is no second item, and so that's why we get an index error. So one question I might ask you, and this will be kind of an introduction to what we're going to look at in a little bit, what could I do in order to decide ahead of time whether it's safe to read the second and third argument. Safe meaning that I know that those arguments are going to be there. You might want to pause again and just think about it. How could we tell whether the second and third arguments have been passed at the command line? Okay, here's the answer. Sysargv is a list. Sysargv will have one item. If I'm expecting there to be two others, I know then that that sysargv list will have three items in it. So I can say something like, if len sys.argv is equal to or is not equal to 3, maybe I'll exit and say, please pass 2 arguments, or whatever specific error message I'd like to give. This is going to allow me to check ahead of time. Now we're going to look at a different way to check when we get to exceptions, which we'll look at in a video in this session. But this might be one way to do it. All you need to understand and all you need to connect here, if anything here is unclear at this point, is to understand first that sys.argv is a list, that sys.argv is always available. Doesn't matter what we're doing or whether we pass arguments. Sys.argv will always have at least one item, and that will be a string with the program name. That any additional arguments or any arguments passed at the command line will also be added to the sysargv list, and that we can check to see if any arguments have been passed. A lot more than I was expecting, by checking the len. Of sysargv.